Welcome to the Rising Entrepreneurs Podcast, where we feature top founders and entrepreneurs and their journey. Now, let's get started with the show.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I am the host of this show, and you know, if you've listened before that, every week we feature smart CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs from all kinds of companies, and you can check out the archives to see some of our episodes. I am the co-founder of Rise25, which is a company that helps B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. And this episode is brought to you by EO San Francisco, which is the Bay Area chapter of Entrepreneurs Organization, which is a global peer-to-peer network of more than 20,000 influential business owners across 200 chapters, 60 countries. And if you are the founder, co-founder, or controlling owner or controlling shareholder of a company that generates over 7 figures a year in revenues, and you want to connect with other like-minded, successful entrepreneurs, EO is for you. And you can learn more about us at eosf.org and email us at admin@eosf.org. All right, my guest today is Scott Kabat. He is the founding partner and CEO at 621 Consulting, which he launched in 2017 in the San Francisco Bay Area, built a community of over 300 fractional CMOs and marketing operators who provide strategic, operational, and organizational guidance to companies that are navigating scale-up and strategic transitions across various different industries. And prior to doing that, he served as CMO at One Medical Group, and he's also held a number of different positions as CMO at Prezi. We also worked, had a startup that went through Y Combinator, worked on the Flip video brand. If you remember that product, I had one. We'll ask about that as well and hear about his whole journey. But Scott, I love always starting people with what they were like as a kid and any little side hustles that they had as a kid. And you said, my side hustle was swim lessons. Growing up in North Carolina and making money teaching kids to not drown. Tell us about that.
That's right. Hey, John, good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
So yes, background, I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina. I was did not have great entrepreneurial vision as a kid, to be honest with you. I don't think I was fairly cautious in my risk profile. I did get into swimming year-round, and that was my life for several years. And my sister and I, during the summers, would just live at the pool, hang out with our friends there, and practice all day. And eventually, that led to getting a job as the coach, assistant coach, eventually head coach of the summer team that I used to compete on as a kid. And so, through my teen years, yes, I coached about 100 kids, age 5 to 18. That was a great learning experience and gave me a little bit of a preview of what it would be like to be a parent much later in life. And then to kind of side hustle, make some extra money before I went off to college, I taught swim lessons all day long in between practice. And I mean, really gratifying, really exhausting,
Yeah.
in the bed, in the pool, not the bed, the pool, holding little kids, teaching them to put the face in the water, getting them to dive down and all that. Super fun. And it's neat to sometimes come across them and hear what they're up to. They're grown-ups now.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so cool. It's such a critical life skill too, right? It's if you can prevent kids from drowning, it's such a wonderful thing.
That's right. And I will say that one of the things I learned from being a swimmer that I've carried with me in life and tried to impart on my kids is just kind of losing yourself in the process and finding value and grinding away day after day. And I did take a lot of that kind of foundational experience. I wasn't a very good swimmer when I started, and learning from just grinding it, that was something that taught me a degree of discipline I think I've used later on.
Yeah. It seems like you had, you kind of threw yourself into a couple of different things. Athletics, swimming was a big part of your life. Academics as well. I mean, you went to Penn and then Harvard. You got an MBA at Harvard, and then became an entrepreneur after a number of years working in the corporate world. I want to talk about some of those different corporate stints along the way. So Flip Video, for those who don't know, was this super cool little device. It was maybe around the time that USB was starting to take off, and we were kind of this tech transition from like using floppy disks of different sorts, and then they had this USB. So, well, you can describe it. It was a little cool little video device that could just plug straight into a computer.
Yeah, look, that was an incredibly rewarding experience. And one of my business partners now is my old boss, the guy who hired me to launch Flip. And so I'll tell you just that, quick backstory was came out of Harvard Business School at the height of the dot-com boom. And, a lot of folks were going into, what became, pets.com or, various startups that flamed out. Some went to eBay and, companies that made it. I didn't really have the confidence to bet on myself then. I felt like I really needed to learn and to cut my teeth. I was interested in marketing. I went and worked at Clorox for several years, kind of learning the fundamentals of brand marketing and what it means to own a P&L. And then eventually decided I was ready. Bad timing, right when I became a dad, to go leave and go to my first startup. And Flip was just an idea then. We had this notion that we could build a brand and launch it. And so I was there from the inception in terms of, everything from what are we going to name it? What's the story we're going to tell retailers, Best Buy, Walmart, Costco. How are we going to sell this story to the press and explain why it's new and different and not just another boring electronic? The problem, if you go back in time, was that people would buy these fancy video cameras and then you can never get the video off. Like it would you'd shoot your just big special occasions, like your kid's graduation ceremony,
Yeah.
and it would sit in your closet. And we had a real commitment to thinking there was a way to democratize that. But a lot of the discipline was keeping the product really simple and building a brand that could really empower people to share their lives. And this was right as YouTube was starting to take off, and we became a vehicle to help democratize video. And so, yes, literally, I went from selling the first camcorder to 3 years later, we're the number one selling product in the category, and we're acquired by Cisco. But if you ask anyone from our team, I handpicked the folks on that brand marketing team, and I would still go to war with them any day of the week. And this is almost 20 years later.
Was the product fully baked when you came in, or was it still in development?
We had a test market, so the prior incarnation of the company had been focused on single-use imaging products. Like I don't know if you remember, you could buy cameras, like one-time use cameras, take them into the drugstore, and they'd
Yeah.
process it and give you a CD. So the company had done that originally with kind of the first version of a digital camera, which
Mm.
there were no one-time use digital cameras, and they tried video and found that consumers were saying, "Hey, I wish I could keep this thing."
Mm.
So we had the idea of a product. It was still in development. And so we were working on the features and also figuring out like what's the brand going to be. Everything we had done
Yeah.
before was private label, so we had to bring that all to life and figure out how we were going to seed the grassroots without a whole lot of money to spend.
Wow, it was such a cool product. I mean, I remember having one, and I didn't have a lot of money back then, so I don't remember the price point was, but
Like $130.
okay.
Yeah,
Yes, it wasn't too expensive. I mean, I think I might have had it later in its life cycle. I think it'd been around for a few years before
right,
I got one, but I just remember how
right.
cool it was to have something like that because I grew up with a dad who had a camcorder, and you're right, it was like this massive heavy thing that you only got out
Park
for
it on
like
your shoulder. Yeah,
soccer games and weddings. You'd get it around,
right,
and then
right.
you'd have to, oh wait, do we have a blank videotape lying around? Okay, we do. Okay, put that in, and and you didn't consume it as much. So what a cool time to be involved in that.
No,
So
thank you.
you go to Cisco. You're there for a
Yeah,
while after it's acquired. What was it like going? So you'd kind of gone corporate, Clorox, to the
yeah,
startup ecosystem for a few years, and then back to corporate. You're in a big corporate environment again.
sure.
What were you like mentally at that point in time, being back in the corporate world?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, Cisco had such an enormous machine and global footprint, and they were so well oiled in terms of how they acquired and integrated companies. We were a little bit of a strange acquisition for them because their core DNA was an enterprise, and we were primarily a consumer business. And the whole ethos was that they wanted to bring in a team that knew consumer and could help really grow that. So we operated pretty autonomously for a while. So it was really working with the core folks that came in. I think that over time, it just proved to be a mismatch for a number of reasons. The market changed. Some of the dynamics of Cisco's priorities changed, and it was so that was a painful period, I think, for everyone on both sides because we ultimately came to the conclusion that it just wasn't really a match. But amazing learning experience, and I learned a lot from just seeing the scale at which Cisco could operate globally was really new to me. When I was at Clorox, they had some international business, but it was primarily domestic. And Cisco just had such a large footprint and so much vision. I presented to John Chambers a couple times, and just seeing his vision about the guy, thinking 5, 10 years down the road. So I learned from that, and I learned I wanted to get back to the startup world. Culturally, it wasn't somewhere I realized I had become enough of a startup person that, I wasn't, I didn't want to end my career doing that.
So you go to work for a startup as you're having your first kid, then you go back to the corporate world.
Had another kid along the way. Yeah.
And then you're like, all right, honey, I'm going to go start my own startup. So you start this Knowmia, which is an online platform for teachers. And you even go through Y Combinator, which when I think of Y Combinator, I haven't been through it, but I'm just imagining a group of 23, 24-year-olds, who don't sleep and all they do is focus on their startup. What was that experience like?
Yeah, amazing learning experience. So I teamed up with our old CPO from Flip, who was a fantastic guy and just brilliant product guy. Had this idea of Knowmia, and I joined as his co-founder. And we thought, hey, we're both going into a new space in edtech. Let's kind of just go back to school and go through YC and learn from that. Taught us both a ton about just some of the fundamentals, the lean startup fundamentals that YC has dialed in really well. I also think, to your point, you are correct that like we were both 40 at the time. We were a little bit of a mismatch for how they typically operate. Like people ask me all the time, like, what's the biggest thing you learned? I learned I wish I started a company when I was 22.
Yeah.
Because my co-founder and I both had families and bills to pay and all that, and so we built a product, we got some traction. I think we also realized that, hey, to really get this thing to scale is probably going to be a longer horizon than either of us have. So we eventually.
What was the idea behind it? It was an online platform for teachers. Was it?
The idea was, Khan Academy was just starting to take off, and the idea was that every kid learns differently, and what if we could enable, like, give them access, or even give teachers access to content from other teachers from all over. So we created a content creation tool on the iPad. And we created basically a library where teachers from all over could publish and index videos, and then you could go find them. So depending on how you learn and what you want to learn more about, like if you need some tutoring or extra help, you could go find it. Got to know a ton of teachers, and a lot of startups. I loved working in that space, just really mission driven, and the companies were all very open. When I was in hardware, it was very protected. Like, we don't want you to see our secrets, and just a real sense of purpose. And everyone I came across in the education space, so we learned a ton from it. And unfortunately, I see this with a lot of ed tech companies. They have great ideas that have a hard time getting to breakthrough velocity when it comes to revenue growth. Like there's just an upper bound of how much you can monetize.
And what was the
platforms
idea behind monetizing it? How were you going to monetize it?
We wanted to build a two-sided marketplace, and there was a lot of debate, as we would talk with the YC partners and with other potential investors and folks around whether to focus more on the supply side or the demand side first. I mean, what we were trying to do is essentially to have gated content that you could pay for essentially tutoring or supplemental instruction. We didn't want to charge teachers or school districts. We ultimately got to the point, like as we talked to some potential strategic investors and B2B partners, that I think that we realized there was a pathway to scale it through selling to districts, and that really wasn't our DNA. We knew how to sell to consumers. Mm-hmm. So we sold the business to an online education company that had more of a motion and a footprint to do that. And so Knowmia is still around. They've tweaked it and evolved it, but it was a really great learning experience, and I did learn a ton from the whole I reference the YC experience a lot, and a
What?
couple of the companies I was in uh, with then have been just wildly successful.
Yeah. And what
Yeah.
was it intimidating going through the YC like demo day and
Oh
all
yeah.
the pitches and all that kind of stuff,
Oh
raising
yeah.
money?
Super humbling. Super humbling. We raised some money, and we got to the point where it was like we needed to raise more, and we went through the process of selling a story that honestly wasn't really landing, and um, that was where we realized like, hey, we got to hunker down and really bootstrap this thing for an extended period of time, or we have to go to Plan B, and we
Mhm.
ultimately went to Plan B.
Yeah. And that's a hard thing is, facing that kind of rejection over and over again with
It
people
is.
saying like, I don't like your baby. I don't want your baby.
That's right.
You need to
Well,
change your baby before I buy your baby.
that's true. And the trick is a lot of times they don't opine on your baby. They say, bring your baby back to me in a month or 3 months. And you have to you have to keep pushing on those. And sometimes you never get an answer about how they feel about your baby.
So I'm looking at your history here, and it's almost like this porridge is too hot, this porridge is too cold, this porridge is just
Right.
right. So you had the
Yeah.
corporate experience, the big corporate experience, you had the
Yeah.
small startup experience, and then you go and you work as CMO at Prezi and One Medical Group, which I don't know how
Right.
big either of those companies were at the time, but they kind of
Yeah.
strike me as at the time they were like not tiny companies, but also not huge companies either.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation, John. I think the common thread through both of those was um, they were companies who had gotten out of the gate, gotten some traction with their product and some initial, virality, raised some equity, and then got to the point where they really needed to up level and professionalize their go-to-market engine. And so my mandate in both of those was to kind of scale the marketing machine, the marketing team, and really thoughtfully up level the brand. One of the things I learned in the Flip experience that was kind of a common thread through Prezi and One Medical also was balancing. How do you think about CAC LTV and monetization, but also balancing that against a brand narrative. And the common thread through all three of those, Flip, Prezi, and One Medical, was likable brand and unlikable category, right? Like with
Mm,
Flip, we were competing against that big hulking camcorder your dad had.
yeah,
Prezi, like, we're competing against PowerPoint, which everyone has, but nobody loves.
right.
And then One Medical, like, what's less likable than US primary care, right?
Yeah, right.
And so, this whole notion of building a challenger brand and tying that to the mission and values of the company. Like, one of the things I loved about One Medical and still do is the passion of the people and the commitment to the service delivery and the way we connected that to the marketing was a fundamental part of what we did.
Yeah, it occurred to me that not everyone is familiar with what One Medical
Right.
is or what it
Yeah.
looks like. There's one not too far from me,
Right.
and it's really cool. Like you look at this, the waiting room is actually quite elegant. It's like an elegant doctor's waiting room, and you have kind of a fast track to getting access to a doctor. Can you explain kind of how the
Sure.
company was different?
Yeah, it's funny. I just got back. I was in Dallas last week at a portfolio CEO meeting of a private equity firm. Got all their CEOs together, and we're presenting to them on some marketing best practices. And one of the things I referenced about the One Medical experience was um, the fundamental idea was there is a better way to do primary care, and that can't just be through the care itself. It has to be the end-to-end experience. So it's everything. And think about all the pain points you have today with going to see your primary care physician. It's like, hey, I'm waiting on the line for 45 minutes to get a hold of someone. They don't have an appointment for 2 weeks. When I'm there, they rush
Two
me in and
weeks,
out in
three
five
months.
minutes.
Yeah,
three
yeah,
months.
right, yeah,
They rush me
yeah,
in and out, or I go into the office and it feels sterile, and I'm wearing this kind of icky paper gown. And
yeah.
so the whole idea with One Medical was to reinvent all of that. And we looked at it as a hospitality business. Like, we actually had everyone read Danny Meyer's book about hospitality. And so, we essentially wanted to upend that whole end to end experience of primary care.
Interesting. Now, after you ended up leaving One Medical,
Yeah,
you kind of went through an existential angst. You want to talk
I
about that?
did. I
Yeah.
did. Yeah, I had ever since coming out of business school, had very carefully been curating my career. Like I knew that the Clorox experience would teach me a lot of the fundamentals. And then when I went to go launch Flip, it was, a company that already, that had a legacy business that could pay me a salary, and that'll lead into, the next marketing role and the next marketing role and that kind of thing. And I got to the point where I had done a couple of CMO gigs and I wasn't sure that I wanted to go back and do that again. And it took me a while to reckon with that. I started doing some fractional CMO work for, mostly Series A, Series B startups that didn't need a CMO but needed a strategic thought partner, really to pay the bills and buy myself some time. Um, and I spent a lot of time reflecting and writing and thinking like, hey, I've been on this path. It's not that there's a problem with that path or that I condemn it. It just I wasn't sure that I was finding as much meaning and purpose in it as I wanted. It was also challenging. My kids were getting older, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing that. And so it took me, a couple of years of kind of being betwixt and between on that, and in the meantime, dabbling with the fractional work before I really gave myself permission to burn my ships and lean in fully to building what we've turned into 621.
And why fractional? Why did you
Yeah.
embrace that model?
Yeah. Look, I think that there's an argument for fractional and a number of different functions, but look, I know marketing, and why I will tell you that I see it as a really valuable fit for a lot of companies when it comes to marketing is that there's been this incredible proliferation over the last, let's say, 15-ish years of special marketing specialties. So there's so many different flavors of marketers, and they all have legitimate experience. It's very hard for companies to know what kind of marketing leader they need when and for the next phase. And oftentimes, even if they get it right, there's a slight course correction in the business and you end up out of alignment, right? And so what we've done in building our team at 621, we've got a deep bench of fractional CMOs and marketing operators. Everybody's grown up in startups, so they've all been there, done that. We're not meant to come in and be a replacement for these companies building a full-time team. Oftentimes we'll coach them through that. But we can get them through these inflection points where we'll be a thought partner or, build the basic machinery and then help them think through, okay, what kind of leader do you need? What kind of team do they need around them? Does that team need some leverage? That kind of thing. So I think it's the fractional model works really well when you're navigating change, whether that's a funding round or ownership change, like a private equity buyout. We work with PE a lot, or change in leadership.
And what so there's the again, it's kind of like a marketplace we were talking about earlier. There's supply
Right.
and demand side,
There
right?
is. Yeah.
How did you build the supply side? That is like how did you
Yeah.
find other talented, experienced CMOs who could,
Sure.
be your CMOs that you're delegating the work to?
Yeah. And it's, let me point out one nuance. So, yes, while we have a supply and demand side, it was very important to us from the beginning not to operate like a transactional marketplace. So, I have business partners, all of whom are, one I went to business school with, one who is, I mentioned the guy who hired me to work on Flip. We have a management team and another member of our executive team who leads all our staffing. And we are all very intimately involved in overseeing these relationships. So, when we meet a company, we go through a process of working through what they need, what their priorities are, and figuring out who in our team is the right solution. And oftentimes these become land and expand relationships. And to answer your question, this started off with people I had worked with before, and then it expanded to people we knew and trust, referring people they know and trust, and we always vet them and back channel them, get references. So these aren't just LinkedIn connections; they're all people we feel really comfortable. And the members of our executive team have all brought in people they've worked with in the past. So these are people we know well and we trust. And it's incredibly important. I always tell our folks that we want people who are great at what they do, high commitment to experiment and iterate, and first class integrity. And from there we learn together. And with most of them, we start building out repeatable acts from one company to another.
So given your feelings about this kind of like angst around whether to remain
Mhm.
with being a CMO, how did you design the business so that you felt like it was something that you wanted to keep on doing and that it didn't
Yeah.
continue that feeling of angst?
Yeah, it's a great question, John. I think for me, there was this underlying, and I found this at my business school reunions too, as we got older, where everyone was grappling with, well, what's my why, right? What's the purpose in all this? And um, I was really enjoying the stimulation and the pattern recognition of the fractional work and also just running my own business. I don't really do much client work anymore. It's more now kind of tending to both the supply side and demand side. And what I ultimately found as I kind of got some reps with this was what I found in my why was that I want for our team, want to be an enabler for each of these people to make a living doing that superpower thing that they love, that maybe they didn't get to do enough of when they were in an operating role and doing a little bit of everything. Make a living doing that and also live the life you want to live outside of work, right? Like we're super transparent on that. Some of our folks are, going at it, 50, 60 hours a week. Some of them are like, look, I'm a working parent, like staff me for 3 days a week, or I'm going to take this June off. And that's a part of the model. And we work with that.
Mm.
So, I think for me, finding a way to be an enabler for our team has been really gratifying because I think honestly, a lot of them having grown up as marketers have been a little exhausted by the churn that marketers go through and getting whipped around inside operating roles.
Right. Did it take a while for you to kind of, from a business perspective, you'd performed the role of a CMO inside of a company
Yeah,
many times
yeah,
before, but
yeah.
then you develop this business that has, instead of one client or one company you're working
Right.
for a lot of different clients, and then you're managing, all these other CMOs and marketers that are working for you. Did it take a while for you to figure out that business model?
It did. It did. I went through a big transition from it, essentially being Scott Inc., right? Like doing my own fractional advisory work to playing more of a support role and selling new work and tending to the internal business operations and recruiting people to come in. So there was a transition involved in that. I think underneath your question is one that I talk about a lot with people who are dabbling in fractional work, which is like, will it feel different when you're the single throat to, you're used to being the single throat to choke, whereas now, like, you're coming in, you're helping out, you're giving advice, but you're not a full-time employee, and maybe you're toggling between multiple companies. Um, and I do think that's an adjustment. One of the things that I found stimulating that I think our team would echo is that there's something very energizing about getting to a point in your career where you step back and you have to reflect on all the things you've learned, and then how can you repackage them in a very surgical way to add value to the companies you work with, and to do that quickly. Like, they don't want you in there taking 6 months trying to figure out where the water cooler is. You need to put points on the board quickly. We usually work a 90-day sprint. um, and I think there's something really, for the folks who really enjoy this work, get energized by that. Like, hey,
Yeah.
I'm finding a way to give value and to give back wisdom in a really meaningful way. Sometimes it's as an advisor and coach. Other times it's like we're building a rev ops or account-based marketing machine or brand positioning for a company and handing it off to them and making sure they operationalize it. But everything we do is in partnership with these folks. We embed in there, so we're kind of de facto members of the team anyway.
How do you approach potential threats to the business that you've built? You survived
Yeah,
COVID, and now
yeah.
we are recording this in mid 2025, and AI is
It's
everything
perfectly
everyone's talking
predictable,
about.
John. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. How do you approach those things or think about those things?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I learned early in my entrepreneurial journey was to make sure you're spending the majority of your time on offense, right? Like, I think it is tempting to spend all day kind of just parrying potential threats and reacting. And then what happens is you don't spend enough time really leaning in on the bigger strategic capability building or, um, you know, people-related opportunities. So I try to focus more on like what can we control. I'm a big fan of the Stoics. It's a lot about understanding what's in your control and what's outside. And to your point, like it's incumbent upon us to be savvy to what's happening in the marketplace. So AI, to your point, is a perfect example. And we are like really embracing it. I think there's somewhat of this fear of like AI is going to take away marketing jobs. Our approach has been more like, let's teach marketers to really harness it and take advantage of it, and also to recognize that it's changing every day. So we're trying to stay on top of that and make sure that our folks on the front line are sharing what they're learning, as well as some of the watchouts they're seeing. And then we can pass that wisdom on to the companies we meet and investors we meet.
It's a great approach. Scott, this has been really interesting. I want to thank you for your time. And where can people go
Thanks,
to learn
John.
more about you and connect with you and learn more about 621 Consulting?
621consulting.com, and you can find me on LinkedIn, Scott Kabat, Kabat.
Excellent, Scott. Thanks so much.
Thanks, John.
Thanks for listening to the Rising Entrepreneurs Podcast. This episode is powered by Rise 25. Please subscribe and check out future episodes.